Planning cash requirement. In most cases, to search for the optimal working cash balance, probably or status that our capabilities, we must be content to get reasonably close. Perhaps we should substitute the word appropriate for optimal. The current account balance that the firm should maintain is the compensating balance requirement or the optimal working balance, whichever is greater. Some firms, especially those with seasonal sales patterns, may find that the appropriate working balance varies somewhat over the year. As a firm grows, appropriate working cash balance also will grow, although probably not proportionally. Once we have settled on the appropriate balance to be maintained in current account, we can integrate cash management into the financial planning process. The projected current account balance goes into the pro forma balance sheet. Any excess cash or the figure that may be invested in interest bearing assets. Investing idle cash. Cash in excess of requirement for working balances normally is invested in interest bearing assets that can be converted readily to cash. A firm might hold excess cash for two principal reasons. First, the firm's working capital requirement may vary over the year, perhaps in fairly predictable manner if the variation is due to recurring seasonal factors. From the pro forma balance sheet, it was apparent that excess cash would build up during seasonal lows in accounts receivable in inventory and would be needed later to finance a re-expansion of receivables and inventory during the next seasonal high. We can view the excess cash as a part of the firm's transaction balance even though the cash is temporarily idle. There is a predictable requirement for it later. Second, second, excess cash may be held to cover unpredictable financing requirement. In a world of uncertainty, cash flow can never be predicted with complete accuracy. Competitor act, technology changes, strikes occurs, products fail, and economic conditions vary. On the positive side, attractive investment opportunity may suddenly appear. A firm may choose to hold excess cash to finance such needs if and when they occur. We need we noted earlier that cash held for such purposes is referred to as a precautionary balance and usually invested in interest-bearing assets until needed. An alternative exists to the holding of excess cash for the either of the two purposes described above. The firm can simply borrow short term to finance variable requirements as they arise. Under such a policy, the firm would never hold excess cash. A firm's choice between short term borrowing versus liquid assets as a means of financing variable requirements will depend on policy decision with respect to the firm's long term financial structure, particularly the mix of short term and long term funds. We will discuss overall financial structure in the relationship between maturity structure and liquidity later. Here we take as a given the long term structure and the amount available for investment in interest bearing assets. Investment criteria. A firm might invest excess cash in many types of interest bearing assets. To choose among the alternative, we must establish criteria based on our reason for investing excess cash in the first place. We are investing either temporary transaction balances or precautionary balance or both. When we need the cash, we want to be able to obtain it all of quickly. Given these objectives, we can rule out equity share and other investment with return that are not contractual and with prices that often vary widely. Debt securities with a contractual obligation to pay are our best candidates. In selecting among debt securities, there are three principal characteristics we should examine: default risk, maturity, and marketability. Default risk refers to the possibility that interest or principal might not be paid on time and, and in the amount promised. If the financial market suddenly perceive a significant risk of default on a particular secular security, the price of the security is likely to fall substantially, even though default may not actually have occurred. Investors in general are averse to risk, and the possibility of default is sufficient to depress the price. Given our purposes in investing excess cash, we want to steer clear of securities that stand any significant chances of defaulting. In an uncertain world, there is no guarantee that is absolutely certain with its capacity to create money. However, there are securities available with default risk that is sufficiently low to be almost negligible. In selecting securities, we must keep in mind that risk and return are related, and that low risk security provide a lowest return. We must give up some return in order to purchase safety. Maturity refers to the time period over which interest and principal payment are to be made. A, a 20 years bond might promise interest similarly and principal at the end of the 29th year. A six months bank certificate of deposit would promise interest and principal at the end of the 6 months. When interest rates vary, the prices of fixed income securities vary. A rise in market rate produces a fall in price and vice versa. Because of these relationships, debt securities are subject to a second type of risk, interest rate risk. In addition to default risk, a government bond, though free of default risk, is not immune to interest rate risk. The longer the maturity of security, the more sensitive its price is to interest rate changes, and the greater to its exposure is to interest rate risk. For this reason, short maturities are generally best for investing excess cash. Marketability refers to the ease with easy which an assets can be converted to cash. With reference to financial assets, the terms marketability and liquidity often are used synchronously. Marketability has two principal dimensions: price and that time that are interrelated. If an asset can be sold quickly in large amount at a price that can be determined in advance within narrow limits, the asset is said to be highly marketable or highly liquid. Perhaps the most liquid of the financial assets are treasury bills. On the other hand, if the price that can be realized depend on significantly on the time available to sell the asset is said to be illiquid. The more independent the price of time, the more liquid the assets. Besides price and time, the third attribute of marketability is low transaction cost. Now we'll talk about yields. All the characteristics we discussed above, the default risk, maturity, and marketability affect yield. In general, the lower the default risk and the better the marketability. The lower the yield, security with these desirable characteristics have higher price. And since price and yields are inversely related, lower yields. The relationship between maturity and yields more complex changes over time. On the average, short maturity yields less. Other factors being equal. Because they are subject to less interest rate risk. Rates on short maturities, however, are more volatile than those on longer maturities in time and at times exceeds the latter. At any point in time, rates on major types of money market securities discussed above are fairly close to one another. For equal maturity, the differentials usually are small and are due to small differences in default risk and marketability. Over time, the, the entire structure of short-term rates varied significantly. Such variations are related to the business and monetary cycles, the demands for funds by individuals and firms, and the credit policies of the RBI. Now we will talk about the collection and disbursement system. Primary objective of a collection system is to receive value from the buyer as quickly as possible. Secondary objective is to receive and the process information associated with the payment. The longer the delay, the more the funds that will tied up in it. If we define the system in terms of linear programming model, the objective function that we need to minimize is objective Function: minimize the cost of collection float, value of payment information, value of relationship with pairs plus collection. uh, huh? Cost of losses through theft and fraud. Right, nothing. Plus means that the function is to go with the objective. Here to minimize and means that is has to go against the stated objective to maximize rather than minimize in this case. Now we will talk about the plot. What is plot? Plot could be defined as the amount of funds represented by check that have been issued but not yet collected. Or it could be defined as the time between the deposits of check in the bank and its payment. Due to the time difference, many firms are able to play the float, that is to write check against money not presently in the firm's bank account. There are different kinds of floats that the firm has to encounter. These includes collection float. Time taken to realize that the money after the company has received the check from the debtor. Mail float. Time that elapse, elapses from the mailing of the check until it received. Processing float. Processing time after the check is received and before it is deposit deposited with the bank. Now we'll talk about availability float. Time taken from the deposit of the check to the funds being available in the bank. The last two items together make up deposit float and all the three items make up the collection float. Float measurement. Float is unusually measured in rupees days, which are calculated by multiplying the time lag in days by the rupee amount being delayed. float can be measured either on each item that is processed or on average daily basis. Cost of collection float. The cost is determined by the following formula: money in float, number of days, daily interest rate, frequency of payment. Value of payment information. Matching payment to account in a timely and accurate manner. The biggest utilization is to update the system so that actual position of funds in the account are available. Value of relationship with pay. Delays in posting may send wrong information to customer. Could also cause delay in shipments, as you may be withholding shipment for the payments. Now we'll talk about the collection system costs. Cost, cost, costs, 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 costs of receiving the money from the customer till the time the payment reaches the office, and costs of processing in the office. Cost of losses from fraud and theft. Cash collection could involve fraud and theft, which could negate the effect of excellence collection system.